Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I would like to introduce Christine Grant to get us started with today's program.
Thank you, Samantha. And good afternoon and welcome to everyone to our International Women's Day program, Standing Up and Breaking Through International Women's Day is observed annually on March 8th and celebrates the global social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. According to the International Women's Day website, today is a call for action to advance gender equality. Before we begin our program, we want to take this moment of silence to send our thoughts and prayers to the people of Ukraine, especially women and girls, and we are hoping for a peaceful resolution. A moment of silence, please. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Bray, Paige Bray. She is the director of the Center for Montessori Studies and associate professor of early childhood education here at the University of Hartford. She has worked with colleagues, allies, and accomplices in the community to address systemic inequities for over 3 decades. Her teaching expertise focuses on the personal, reflexes, and professional identity transitions fostered through dynamic inquiry and the use of metacognitive tools with pre-service and in-service teachers across the career continuum. Paige, thank you so much for agreeing to be our moderator today. Thank you, Paige.
It's my pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm happy to have the honor to introduce the people who will moderate with me as well as our guests today. I want to first go ahead, next slide, please, and introduce Reagan. Reagan was born and raised in Connecticut and is now a junior at the University of Hartford, who double majors in the digital media and journalism and communication. She's a community organizer and youth development specialist in the Blue Hill Civics Association, which for those who don't know is our neighbor in our neighborhood right here in North Hartford, working with production and youth as her primary passion. She works to infuse the remedies of positive, productive leadership skills into youth to develop youth people who can build their community, all while documenting their stories through production. Reagan, it's great to have you with us today. I'd also like to introduce Megan Powell. Megan Powell is an accounting major from South Windsor, Connecticut, a senior at the Barney School of Business's 3+1 program. This is an intensive accelerated program that Megan has completed in only 3 years. In addition to her academics, she's very involved in campus clubs as a member of the Women Advancement Initiative LEAD program, the Spotlight chairperson for the Barney Leadership Council, and vice president of Beta Alpha Phi Accounting Honor Society. She's going to be graduating in a few months in May and will be joining the Price Waterhouse Coopers audit associate as an audit associate. Welcome, Megan. And last but not least, we are thrilled to have a conversation today with Dr. Mariko Silver. Dr. Silver is the president and CEO of the Henry Luce Foundation. She's the previous president of Bennington College. During the Obama administration, she served for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as the acting assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretary for international policy. Dr. Silver has served for the Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano, pardon my pronunciation, as the policy advisor for economic development, innovation, and higher education. Before taking her turn with government service, she was instrumental in transforming and the expansion of the Arizona State University and led work on the economic development policy, metrics, science, technology, and innovation policy for the K-12 and higher ed policy, sustaining science and global health. Dr. Silver is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. She serves on the board of Scholars at Risk, African Leadership University, and the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Arts. She holds a PhD in economic geography from UCLA, on a Master's of Science in Science and Technology Policy from PRU, University of Sussex in UK. And her BA, it makes her a local Connecticut person with a history from degree in history from Yale University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Silver. We are excited to have a conversation today, a multi-generational conversation. And I'm going to go ahead and start with a question for you to get us warmed up, and then Megan and Ray will join in and we will go where this takes us, valuing your extensive experience and thinking about all the women across generations coming together today to amplify ourselves and our work. So thinking about the fact that you've been a leader across so many diverse contexts, what is the one of the recurring issues that you felt you've needed to stand up for, Dr. Silver?
So first, Paige, Professor Bray, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm only jealous, Reagan, that we're not all sitting in the sunshine together with you. You've got the best lighting. So maybe someday we can all just sit together in the sunshine and talk. So it's really a pleasure to be with you. I miss enormously being together with students and faculty and staff as part of an academic enterprise and a shared community. So it's always an honor, a pleasure, and a thrill for me to be in that kind of environment, even if only virtually, though I hope someday soon it will not be only virtually. So thanks so much for having me, and I look forward at some point to coming to campus. And thanks so much, Christine, for inviting me. It was such a pleasure to meet you. In fact, Christine and I met at a women's event, a Women of Color event, talking and thinking together about leadership. So I hope I can bring some of those lessons here today, not just from my own experience, but those things that I have had the great honor and privilege to hear from and learn from others. And I look forward to the broader conversation when we open up the Q&A. So in terms of the question you asked, I think it's a great one. I've had the enormous opportunity to work in government, to work now in philanthropy, also to work in higher ed, to work in government at the state level and the federal level, and to work internationally. And I think any environment, and in fact, I hope women, men, people who are non-binary, that we all have moments when we need to stand up, or I would say, in fact, maybe step in. Step into the circle on behalf of something that we believe in and care about. I think we have so much pressure on us actually to always have to fight for the same things all the time. And there are core things, of course, that each of us wants to fight for and work for throughout our lives. But they may take really different shapes depending on the environment that we're in, or the community that we're in, or the kind of institution that we're in. And so one of the things that I have really focused on in the various different kinds of environments that I've had the opportunity to work in and to be in community in is, what can I most bring in this moment? What can I most bring? What can I step in with? And on whose behalf, mine or somebody else's, can I step in this moment? I think we are so, there are times when absolutely standing up is the thing, but sometimes it's stepping in next to somebody. Sometimes it's helping to bring somebody forward, but from the side. And having all of those tools in our toolkits, in some ways, I'm not sure if I should say this, but as women, we have a lot more of those tools that we've had to, frankly, build up over time. And now I'm speaking generationally. My kids are 8 and 9, and I actually think for their generation, this might hopefully look a little bit different. But I think often of that, there's a cartoon that I saw once, and it has a whole bunch of people around the table, mostly men. And there's one woman, and the woman makes a suggestion, and the little caption in the cartoon is, "That's a great suggestion, Paige." Now, if a man could make it, we could take some action. So one of the things that I learned in the Obama administration, there's actually a group of women who were well known for doing this and have talked about it a lot, is amplifying what other women say in the room on principle. Amplifying women's voices in the room. And in fact, I would say that would go for anybody's voice that is not being heard. Anybody's voice in the room that is not being given its due and its due respect. Regardless sometimes actually of whether you agree or disagree with what the person is saying, if you believe that they ought to have a voice at the table, then it's all of our job to make sure that all of those voices are really heard at whatever table that is. Sometimes it's not a table, sometimes it's a street corner, it's a, it's a restaurant, or it's a whatever, but whatever the table is, the metaphorical table, that we are actively making space, making room, standing next to, stepping in with. And sometimes we get so, and I'll say this from government, like so focused on the thing we're trying to move forward, that the obligation on us, not just to listen ourselves, but to make space for other people to listen and to hold space for other people to listen, can get kind of lost in the shuffle. So that would be the thing that I hope that I'm always remembering to step in for.
Thank you so much. And thank you for, while we amplify and honor all the actions of women and girls across the world today and across generations, thank you for naming up front non-binary and allies across. And again, what that looks like across generations to both hold strong, but also be embracing. Thank you so much. Megan, would you like to ask the next question and we'll keep going?
Sure. Thank you, Paige, and thank you, Dr. Silver, for being here with us today. I know this is very exciting to have you speak on such a historical day across the world. So I guess I'll just get right to it. So as a young woman who I'm getting ready to enter the real world soon, I guess you could say, I find it difficult to kind of understand how I should eventually carry myself as a woman in power once I move up into these leadership roles. And just based on literature and movies and all the knowledge that's out there, it seems like there's so many conflicting ways that women leaders are told to act. Should you be more masculine in the room or more feminine? Should you be gentle and kind of quiet, or should you be outspoken in a meeting and getting your voice heard? So in your experiences, how do you sift through these expectations that are kind of swirling around and determine how you should act at, say, a business meeting that you're leading?
So I think, first of all, it's different for everyone. So I would start there. And I think taking account too of, this is a good tip for men too, taking account of how you might be perceived by other people in the room. I think a lot of us are used to doing this, but not necessarily to say, okay, I'm going to be perceived this way and therefore I have to behave that way. But knowing that you're going to be perceived a certain way and then deciding how it is that you want to take on or not that perception. And that it doesn't have to be the same in every instance all along the way. That actually taking on in a sense, a piece of your persona, right? We're all incredibly complex people. And in every social interaction that isn't, our friends and family, and maybe even there too, there's a lot of pressure to be one kind of person, right? Oh, that's Mariko, she's this way, or, she thinks this way, or she is this way, or she presents this way, or she dresses this way, or whatever. And certainly throughout the arc of life, but even like in the arc of a day, I think most of us actually are many different versions of ourselves. Sometimes that's all internal facing, sometimes that's external facing, but we're all many different versions of ourselves. And I think giving, at least I would like to give myself the permission, I won't tell you what to do, but I would like to give myself the permission to bring different parts to the table. And that doesn't mean always, frankly, in my view, that you have to bring your full self to everything. I know we talk about that sort of in the discourse, we talk about that a lot, bring your full self to everything. But I don't actually believe for myself that necessarily you have to bring your whole self to work, for example. Like you get to have a private, you get to have a private life, you get to have things that you don't want to bring in, right? And nobody should push you to bring in things that you don't want to bring in. But kind of looking internally into what's in your toolbox that's authentic to you, that you want to bring in that moment. Right. So I don't know you, Megan, we just met, but you're an accounting major, you're soon to be an accountant, right? I will assume from that you are, deeply and broadly numerate, right? That math is at least kind of your thing, right? But there may be days when you want that to be like, you want to fully embody that you are the person for whom numbers are the language of life. But, like I see that, beautiful photo of a sunset behind you. You've got other things maybe that you care about, that you're interested in. You have an aesthetic sense. You have a sense of, beauty in the world. And there may be days and times when actually that's the thing to bring first. And so really thinking about what part of yourself you want to bring forward. It's true and real also that the external presentation matters. We can wish that it didn't, but it does. All of these decisions that we make about how we present ourselves, I think people in general are used to doing that. At least in my generation, women and girls were more used to doing that than perhaps men in this dominant culture. That's changed a little bit. You can argue that it's for good or for ill, but it has changed. And certainly the kind of, selfie culture, online culture, all of those things have changed all of our perception about how we think about how we present. And I would say a lot of people are probably even more aware about how they physically present, even while the kind of realm of norms has changed to expand, hopefully, to accept and embrace and relish wider ranges of physical presentation. But I think, that question, like when I even just like to bring it down to the very day-to-day level, like when you're sitting in that meeting or in that interview, thinking before you go in, like, what do I want them to take away about me? These people who I'm working with, what do I want? What's the most important thing for them to know? Not even necessarily about me as a whole person, but like me in this particular version of me that I'm bringing to PricewaterhouseCoopers, right? Like, what's the most important thing that people know? And to put that in the forefront, but to make it your own decision. To make it your own decision about what you want to put at the first layer. Because we all have all those layers. And deciding, taking ownership of which one you want to put forward first is, I think, part of writing your own story, taking control of your own story.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that you mentioned authenticity. I think that's huge in today's age. And I know, especially for my generation as well, with the rise of social media, you always see someone telling you to be someone else or to look a certain way. So I think that's a really great reminder for all of us. And that'll definitely be a takeaway from today, just so far, that authenticity is huge.
Yes, and people will continue to tell you. I'll tell one quick story, which is that when I first became a college president, I gave a big speech at a big, fancy dinner. And there was another college president in the audience who was, is, so far as I still know, he is a man. He had been a college president for a long time. He's very well known. He's a lovely human. And I gave my speech, and afterwards he came up to me to say hello. And I said, half joking, I said, like, oh, any tips? Because I had just become a college, any tips? And he said, oh, no, you did it. You did a great job. That was great. It was really interesting. And this, and this were great. And he kind of paused for a second. He said, actually, I think if you're going to give a whole lot more speeches, you should stand up straighter, and you should hold the podium this way, and you should deepen your voice, and you should project your voice, and you should be more stentorian, and you should do this and do that. So he had all this pent up stuff that he wanted to say, but he knew that he maybe shouldn't say it, but he did say it anyway once given enough time. And it was really interesting because when I stepped back, I thought, like, oh, really what he's telling me is that to command a room, he thinks I need to sound more like him. Mm-hmm. That's his experience. That's his perspective. There are lots of different ways to command a room. There are lots of different ways to get people on a team to turn in a particular direction, to feel a sense of ownership of the work. And there are more and less effective ways, but they don't sit on a straight line. And they certainly don't sit on a gender line. So I would just invite you and anyone else to use their imagination, think about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and then think about what's your route to getting there.
As we go to the next question, I want to underscore this notion of intersectionality that I hear you speaking about, right? And the notion of all of us, again, this isn't gender specific, but women often have an awareness of multiple forms of social identity that we can draw on. We draw on, for our mathematical ability, for our role as mothers, for our role in a faith-based organization, for like all of those different all those identities give us some sense of, sometimes they are sources of insecurity, but sometimes they're also sources of power that we can then draw on in that way that you spoke about, in terms of what foot we put forward or how we can draw in places where there's uncertainty. We can draw on those other communities and identities to say, wait, I have the strength to do, I know I can do this. And so that intersectionality, I think, is really important to keep in mind as we go forward. I'm also so grateful to Chris and Lisa and folks to make sure that we have a great little intersection here among the four of us in terms of, public, private, business, the production and media, as well as the different communities we're connected to, even among the four of us. So Ray, we're really excited to hear about your questions. Can you go ahead and give us a question?
Hello, everyone. My name is Reagan. Thank you for having me. Hello, Ms. Silver. Thank you for being here with us. So, like mentioned earlier, I am a community organizer. I work with young people, and I try to develop them as positive people in our community. So, for the young girls that I have in my groups, how do I address, or how do I tell them that we can dilute the stereotypical, images that are portrayed that women are expected to follow, I guess? How do we break those down? How do I tell them that they're beyond these stereotypical limits?
Yeah, I think that, the first thing is to hopefully ground them in the idea that they can imagine for themselves, that they have extraordinary imaginative capacity. How old are they, generally speaking?
About 14 to 17.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to you when my kids are 14 to 17. I'm going to ask you the same question back, but I'll give you my best answer now, which is that, I think starting rooted in their own capacity to imagine and confidence in those tools. So much of the messages that we get, frankly, really everybody who's not at the tippy top of whatever hierarchy we're living in at any particular moment. Most of the messages are that if you're not at that tippy top, whatever that is, that your perspective is lesser. And so I think the first sort of think about it as a kind of the foundational piece is that their perspective not only matters and is important to them, but actually the world needs it. The world needs their perspective. Their community needs their perspective, however they conceptualize their world. And maybe even to say to them, like, what's your world? When you think about the world that you want to live in, you want to move around in, you want to be in, you want to feel fulfilled in, like, what does that universe look like? What does that world look like? What are those kind of nested worlds, right? You're depending on where they're coming from, maybe family, home, community, city, nation, whatever, right? Like however they want to think about that, or maybe they don't think about it geographically in that way. Maybe it's really about kind of conceptual spaces, or I know you're in both the community and the, if I can call it this kind of narrative change business, right? So how do we think about what stories do we want others to know? What do we want other people to know about us? And to start with that rooting, because without that, it's very hard to buffet away and beat back all of the other things that people put on you. If you don't know your own story, then you kind of like a Swiss cheese, right? Like take in all the holes, you just fill them up with other people's stories. So the first question, like, what's the story? And it can change. I think that's it. We just don't give ourselves enough permission for that story to change over time. Like, what's your story today at age 14? What do you imagine your story might be at age 16, 17, 25, et cetera? And like, check back in, let's change along the way. I don't know how long you spend, over time with these girls, or how much time they spend with each other. But like, how can they be connected to one another to be an ongoing conversation about what kinds of stories they want to be rooted in? Not in a rigid way, like, I can never get out of this soil, right? But where do they want to seat themselves so that they can move out and grow and change over time? Sprout new, I don't know, I'm not good with plants, like sprout new leaves, sprout new stems, but just to think about, what are the things that they want to bring to the world, so that when other people put all those other things that somebody else wants from them onto them, they can say yes or no, or maybe, or I'm not sure, or I'm gonna try it, no wait, I don't like it. And to just know that that is their job in life for themselves, is to be rooted in those stories, whatever they want to make them. And it doesn't have to be even the ones that your parents or your community give to you. So that would be my advice. But as I said, when my kids are teenagers, I will be coming right back to you, Reagan. You can tell me.
Thank you.
I want to make sure to let the folks who've joined us today to know that we will be taking questions. So if people want to start putting those in the question and answer, we're ideally question and answer, but I think we can manage some chat too. So feel free to start having those questions come through for anyone on the panel, and of course, specifically for Dr. Silver. I do actually have I'm an early childhood person in my profession, but my own children are now 15 and 19. So I also want to really amplify here that we are honoring the elders and those with many accomplishments, but I also know that one of the key things is the way that youth understand and see things is of huge value to all of us. And so I think that that's one of the things we can do in the sort of long arc of women's ways of knowing, of women tending, and women being perpetuators of culture. We can honor and work multi-generationally to really be able to make change narrative for everyone, but also just to also honor our locations and the work that we do. I get to obviously work with undergraduates and then in a larger arena of adolescents too. And just the narrative, the power of just knowing your own voice and valuing that perspective, I think is something we elders can't say enough back to you. As we have, before some other questions come in, Reagan and Megan, do you want to go ahead and ask other questions? Dr. Silver, is there anything you want to interject here before another question?
Just only to say at Paige, Professor Bray, what you said about, I think we would all be very well served to see the world on a regular basis through the eyes of people who are between the ages of, roughly speaking, 15 and 30, much more often than we do. And so, bringing those voices with equal weight into circles of power and circles of influence, I think is incredibly important and valuable, and that those voices come from all different kinds of communities and perspectives. It's one of the things that actually I think, it's an upside of social media and the internet and Twitter and all of that. We won't talk about the downsides today, but it's an upside, is that that those voices can come to the fore and just even be found, and then hopefully by middle-aged people like us be amplified. And I learned so much from the students at Bennington. I learned more from them than I ever could have imagined about not just the world as it could be and as the world as they imagine it, but the world as it is.
And there's just so much power in the small disruptions. Again, given who I am in the world and my age, it is my 15-year-old son who will disrupt sometimes my notion about like going at like something I'm wearing or something, and will make the most mind-numbingly body positive comment that I don't even have in my frame because that's the frame that they live in. So I just think that, again, I agree with you. And it's bringing all of that to the table with equity. So in the spirit of amplifying our youth, questions from Megan or Brianne?
Sure, I can take another one. So just in general, who would you say is or has been the most influential role model or mentor in your life? And what is the best piece of advice that you've gotten from them?
I'm muted. The person who told me to unmute is the most influential person in my life. I'm not sure I can pick one. So I would say, actually, to me, the most valuable thing is to have a network of mentors. And I'll go back to my answer to the previous question, which is that, you've got lots of different yous inside of you. And there's no other person who has that same configuration of identities, experiences, et cetera. And so finding people with whom the different selves inside of you can connect around particular questions or ambitions or ideas or goals that you have, I think is really valuable. So I would encourage everybody to think about mentors as a network rather than as an individual person, because inevitably an individual person will in some fundamental way think that the right way to go is to be like them. Even if that's not what they're trying to do, even if that's not what they would tell somebody else to do if they were advising somebody else who was mentoring somebody. But it's so deep in most people that the ability as a mentee to kind of take the things that make sense for you and weave them together, rather than looking for a kind of one way of being or one way to do things, and then weaving them together in the way that makes sense for you, would be my general advice. And sometimes the network of mentors, as you consult them, you might consult a bunch of them about the same thing. You might have totally different things that you talk to different mentors about. And mentors, by the way, can be peers as well. They don't have to be older people who are older or more advanced in their career, or even, as Paige and I were saying, I would consider some of the students I've worked with mentors. Absolutely. Not only that they've taught me like some specific thing, but they have helped me to figure out how I want to be in relationship to others, by either demonstrating or calling me out or calling me in on any number of things. And so I think that that engagement with love, but somebody say once, like, mentorship without love is just telling somebody what to do. So having that kind of love embedded and woven into the kind of advice giving that happens, that love and care, I think is really important. If I had to pick someone, it's a little lame, but I'll say my mom. And it really is true, partly by just holding my feet to the fire all the time, but always me never having to doubt that she was doing it with love, and also giving me the freedom to make my own decisions about where I wanted to align with her choices and where I didn't want to align with her choices. And for me to know that both of those were options was incredibly important. She's a powerhouse in her own right, et cetera, et cetera. So she's, she had lots of things to tell me about, about how to move in the world, and I appreciate all of them. I would say the other is probably Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University. He was the person in the workplace who really gave me a sense that my ideas were worth having and worth pursuing. And that I really had something to contribute. And I think there are mentors who talk to you, and there are mentors who enable you to do. And I think both are really important. We tend to think about mentors as people who talk to you, but the people who enable you to do and to embody who you are and who you want to be and the things you want to bring into the world, I think are probably the most important. And I'll just tell one quick story that I've told before, but not in this venue, which is when I was interviewing to become the president of Bennington College, I was at the beginning of the interview process. These interview processes for college presidencies are really long. They're like a year-long thing, and from the sort of beginning to end. And at the beginning, for the first interview, I was pregnant all the way through, but I was pregnant in the way that you can't quite tell at the beginning. And so once I got past the first hurdle and was going to interview with the committee, I asked a number of different mentors, should I tell them? Should I tell them that I'm pregnant? Is that like, is it bad to not tell them? Does it matter? If it doesn't matter to me, in other words, I'm going to take the job regardless, should I tell them? So I asked, roughly I would say 4 or 5 women mentors and 4 or 5 men, multi-generations, multi-perspectives, etc. To a 1, all the women said, you have to tell them. They're going to think you're lying or you're hiding something or you're whatever, you're disingenuous if you don't tell them. And to a 1, the men said, don't you dare. What the hell business is it of theirs? If it were a man whose partner were about to have a child, they wouldn't tell. Why should you tell? And I was like, it's really interesting. And I said to the men, like, well, but how would you feel if it were a woman who didn't tell? And I said, I hope you would put that same hat on that you're putting on with me to say like, oh, well, she has no reason to tell and we have no business. So I went with men, I didn't tell. At a certain point came apparent, then it was the case. It still is illegal to ask, technically speaking, and they were very careful. But it turned out to be the right thing to do because it would have been a distraction. I don't know that they would have made, their great board of trustees, I don't know that they would have made a different choice along the way, but I would have been implicitly asking them to make a choice when there was no choice to be made for them. So just say, I give that example as a way of saying that if I just asked 1 or 2 of my most trusted people, I wouldn't have gotten that range of answers. And then I wouldn't have been in the best position to make my own choice.
Reagan, you want to go ahead, please?
I wanted to ask, aside from being an entrepreneur or starting my own business, what are some other things that I could do to shine bright in my workplace as a woman?
Let's see. Well, so some of the things, of course, are the things that anybody could do, which is to, do the best to be the best at whatever the things are that you're asked to do in the workplace, right? At the same time, I think making sure that at the right moment, maybe it's not like the day 1, but at the right moment, once you've built some relationships, letting people know what it is that you want. What is it that you want to get out of this experience, right? You have to calibrate it in the right way, right? And I'm not here, though there's a conversation to be had about salary and compensation, all those things. I'm not talking about that. But people can't help you, anyone, if they don't know what you want. And so if you feel like the way that Reagan, I'm going to shine in the workplace is if I'm given an opportunity to be a lead storyteller on this kind of story, right? Or to create the images for this campaign or whatever, right? To both ask for the opportunity to do that. And frankly, in some cases, if they won't give you the opportunity to do it anyway. And then to present the work that you did in a way that makes it obvious that you're the person who ought to be doing it. And so there's a kind of being entrepreneurial even within a not so entrepreneurial setting. I think sometimes there are rigid hierarchies, depends on what kind of workplace you're in, right? But sometimes there are rigid hierarchies and people don't like it when you bump up against whatever ceiling they think you're supposed to have. But more often than not, especially if you're in the kind of workplace that at least I would like to work in, people want your ideas. People, sort of above you in the hierarchy, they're looking for good ideas. So if you have good ideas, you should put them forward. My only caveat to that is, so I gave this advice to somebody upon request who worked in the federal government. She's a wonderful, brilliant, slightly younger than me. She's not, I don't know that she's young anymore, but at the time, young woman. And she said, I had this great idea on how to do X, Y, and Z. And I told my boss, and my boss said, no. So then I was in the elevator with my boss's boss's boss. And I told him that I had this idea, and my boss told me no. I was like, oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Because then she's undercut the person who she wants to get to help to support her. So you do have to be mindful, again, federal government is particularly hierarchical. You have to be mindful of the kind of structure that you're in, but finding ways to show that you can do the work and that you have great ideas and moving them through the system. There are always ways to do that. But I think, sometimes frankly, solving a problem for somebody higher up than you that they don't know they have, or somebody else doesn't know doesn't understand is a problem. Sometimes it's a risk, but like being an entrepreneur, sometimes you have to take the risk to get the reward. There's also the other risk, which is that if you don't do that, you're going to feel suffocated and like you just want to give up, right? And that's no good.
Thank you.
I have a question for kind of for all of us, but Dr. Silver, if you'll lead, please. This is from the chat. The Equal Pay Act was signed in 1963, arguably before any of us were born, when women earned just 59 cents to every dollar that men earned. Today, women earn about 78 cents to every dollar that men earn. Why do you think it's taking so long to close the pay gap? And how can we close it more quickly?
So I'm not a labor economist, so I'll just put that little asterisk next to my answer, which is that I don't have a ton of data to back this up. It's anecdotal. I think a couple of things. One is patriarchy hangs on hard. Another is that there are some real structural elements. So I think culturally, we're still not we on this Zoom, but sort of the big we, right? We're still not well adjusted to the idea that people might need to move in and out of the workplace. I think it'll be really interesting actually post-COVID to see if that shifts, but there are still a lot of organizations that expect people to take a very linear path. And so if it's not always true that women have to stop out for childcare, et cetera, or elder care or family care or other things, but statistically speaking, it's more often true for women than men. So if we're looking at the pay gap in aggregate rather than by sector, which is, I think both are important to look at, and geography by geography, both are important to look at. So some of it has to do, I think, with women for good reason, and they should be able to, stopping out and coming back in and being, in a sense, punished for that. I think, again, it's just different sector by sector. And some of it is hiring bias on the front end. I mean, there is lots of good data, which I don't have in my back pocket, but there is lots of good data that men start out at higher salaries in general, because they either get offered higher or they bargain harder at the front end. In general, I would say you're more likely to get the better pay package at the front end or when you're moving from job to job than you are within a job. I think that's probably true for men and for women, but understanding how to negotiate effectively at each of those points is really important. And it's also just true that I think in too many sectors, people just value women's work less, or they lean on all of those tropes, all of those myths about, well, we're going to invest in her and then she's going to leave, right, to have a baby or whatever, or she's going to leave for whatever reason. For whatever reason, women do things, right? So there is this kind of, there are these biases in the system for sure. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is just, again, in aggregate, as opposed to sector by sector, sectors that are traditionally traditionally female majority, if not female dominated, tend to be lower paid sectors than a lot of the male dominated sectors or industries. So again, I think some of this is there's differences sector by sector, but in aggregate, there is still a huge amount of bias in the system.
I would just want to add to that. I think all of us across generations, inclusive of all genders and non-binary, and we can just pay attention to where we see it at play. So obviously from the early childhood field, most of us actually have interactions with, in many cases, predominantly women who work in early childhood, early care, especially preschool or center-based settings, home settings. Many of us have connections to those people. And so how we can pay attention to where we can help amplify their work or write to a legislator or look at those pieces, that would be my home example from early childhood. But we know it's true also for all sorts of industry workers, anyone who stays in a hotel might pay attention to how the people who are servicing that hotel are being treated and paid. So I think that's just a very daily observance that we can do in real time. Megan or Reagan, do you have other things that you want to add to that question, or do you have other questions you'd like to ask? Do you have one more question? I have a sort of finalish question, but I want to make sure that if either one of you have another question you'd like to ask. I know you had several when we had talked.
Sure. Just kind of shifting gears a little bit. And going back to the whole social media idea, do you have a go-to source for where you get your facts and information and your day-to-day news? Because obviously everything seems to be leaning one way or another, but do you have a great source that's your go-to just to get the facts?
That's a great question. So I would say, I would just encourage everybody not to have one source. I know it makes more work, but if you get used to reading a few sources, then you actually can read them pretty quickly or scan them pretty quickly. I think there's a lot of, so much now depends on what the issue is too, that you're looking to understand. There's so much specialty media, which is super hard. Actually, Tressie McMillan Cottom, who writes in the New York Times, she's a sociologist at UNC. She wrote a great piece in the New York Times about where to get different kinds of news about Ukraine, for example, and how to think about and filter those different kinds of news. I think there are, so if you want to just like know what's going on, like what's happening in the world today, I always scan, I scan the major news sources, Washington Post, New York Times, when it's these days BBC for sure too. I think it's really important if you can to consume just a little bit of international news because it just gives a very different perspective even on what's happening in the United States. But I think it's also really important to search out different perspectives. There are a number of newsletters and other things, but I think figuring out there's kind of two different kinds of news reading, if you will. One is there's many different kinds of news reading, but one is like what's happening today, like what crazy or good or whatever, like what's going on. And then there's the how do I understand what's going on. So for the what's going on, I think the major news outlets actually are pretty good to give you some sense. But even those, I think supplementing with a well curated Twitter feed is actually really helpful because I've certainly for myself gotten a whole new framing on something that I thought I understood by just kind of doing a quick doom scroll to see what's happening and how different people are framing it, which then has led me down different pathways. So fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, I think knowing what's going on in the world is a lot harder than it used to be, but it's also a lot easier, right? It's a lot harder because there's a lot more material to sift through. It's a lot easier because a lot of that material is more readily accessible. But anytime you read something, I would say, or anytime I read something that like gets me either like super happy or super heated or whatever, I immediately go and look for some other version of that story. Because if it's triggering all of my, emotions, all my like lizard brain, all my kind of instinctual stuff, or if it's like enormously satisfying, like, aha, I knew I was right, then I know I have to go look somewhere else and just ask the question, is there another way to look at this very same question? So unfortunately, I don't have a good, easy answer for you other than, to take the, 15 minutes in the morning or in the evening and do a scan across and not get stuck in a news cul-de-sac. If you figure out the answer to that question, please do let me know.
Reagan, is there anything else you'd like to add before we go to the last question?
Sure, why not? So continue off social media. Do you feel that social media plays a part in the stereotypical limits in the workplace?
I feel like I should put the question back to you guys, how you feel like social media shapes your perception about what's possible for you as women entering the workplace and engaging in the workplace. I'm not sure that it has for me, and if I can dare say such a thing, for kind of my little micro generation so much. But fortunately or unfortunately, I think it probably will for you guys. So I'm actually curious what you guys think about how it's going to shape the possibilities for you and the perceptions that you face, for good or not?
So honestly, what I've experienced so far, there has been a trend, I want to say, of just young entrepreneurs or people around maybe my age, maybe 18-ish to 25, that group is on fire with their own businesses. They just start with business after business after business after business. And then it's like, that's like the norm now. Everybody needs an LLC. So I feel like that had a part. But I also feel like social media leaves room for those stereotypical standards. Like if you portray an image on social media, I feel like people in real life think that you have to live that in real life. Like this is the actual, or this is the standards that we believe that this is what it looks like in the workplace, on Instagram, Snapchat, whatever. So this is how they think they need to live in real life. But I don't think that should be the case, because I feel like reality and social media are totally different. Social media is the ideal, perfect world that everyone imagines, where you can portray whatever image you want of yourself or someone else at that. But no, I don't think it should be like that. I think real life should be separate from social media in the workplace.
Yeah, and you know, unfortunately, it's something that absolutely you have to think about in terms of presenting yourself to the world. And I don't, you know, most employers now will look at your social media or whatever, if any of it is public, try to, sometimes they even ask for your, like, to be one of your followers or whatever, even if it's a private account, so that they can see how you present yourself. So, you know, that's tough, right? That's a thing that I did not have to deal with. Whatever, I mean, you'll hear old people like me say this all the time, right? Like whatever my youthful indiscretions, they are well in the past, and there's no record of them so far as I'm aware, right? So you guys have that burden to bear in a way that we didn't. But I think too, what you're pointing to, which is like, it's like living only on the social media universe is like living in a world with no peripheral vision. It's just like walking around like this all the time. And you know, back to the earlier conversation we were having about like having lots of different versions of yourself. You know, there are lots of yous in there, and it's very hard. I know some people have like 15 social media accounts and they present some different angle of themselves at each one. That's a whole lot of work, but the whole lot of work that might be better depending on what your goals are, better deployed in the offline world. But I think these are all open questions, and I think some of it may well shift in the next few years in terms of the extent to which, you know, employers, employees, people in the world in general are differently social media savvy. There was this window when people believed that what you saw online more or less was what was real. Mm-hmm. And I think that is no longer the case. But Megan, to your question, the issue now is like, how do we filter through what is and what isn't real? And so that is like that's the next phase here of this, and like, what is trusted space on and sort of a trusted version of yourself and trustworthy version of yourself look like on social media, when we know that those images are curated either by the platform or by the person or some combination of both.
Thank you all so much. This is I appreciate the exchange. We have like another minute or so before we pass it off to wrap up. Dr. Silver, would you just give one insight or some insight about self-care or actions that you do to preserve joy and hope, you know, that would be of use across the generations? And then maybe Megan and Ray can do the same, but some sort of insight about self-care and what you do to sustain your hope and joy.
I would say for me, the biggest thing, and I know, you know, people are different, they need different things, but for me, the two biggest things are probably being connected with other humans, talking to people, exchanging ideas, you know, brainstorming, iterating, and it doesn't have to be about work, right? But just about like life and stuff, and being kind of calibrated by other people's experiences, and kind of having, as I say to my kids, like big listening ears, try to listen for, you know, what are other people really living, right? What are other people experiencing, and how can I how can I engage with that in useful ways? So I'm a kind of, I guess that makes me a little bit of an extrovert on that spectrum, is that other people who really feed me. But I'll be honest, like I really struggled in the pandemic, not being able to engage just in a kind of free flowing way with lots of other people in person. But the other thing for me actually is reading fiction. So that's maybe more on the introverted end, and art. So I don't make it because nobody wants to see that, but I think the experience of entering into somebody else's imagination with an invitation. So whether that's a visual artist or performance, or it's for me, often it's a novel, that's an invitation to enter into somebody else's imagination. And that is, to me, one of the most extraordinary and generous human acts that anyone can undertake. And I consider that to be incredibly precious. And it is one of the ways that I not only learn, but learn to kind of go inside and see what's happening inside as I experience what this other person through the form of that medium is sharing with me from their perspective.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Reagan, and Megan, for your time today and joining us. It's been an honor to spend this time with you all. And I want to pass it over to my colleague, Jane Horath, who's going to wrap up our session today with thanks to Chris and everyone else who's made this possible. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for having me.
So yes, on the wrap up, I wanted to thank everyone for attending today's session. And thank you, Dr. Silver, for the wide-ranging and thought-provoking conversation. Thanks to our moderators, my colleague I'm sorry, I'm going to get it wrong, Bray, Reagan Bird, and Megan Powell. I also want to acknowledge the Women's History Month Planning Committee. We'll see on the slide, yes, the names of the planning committee, obviously, Lisa Cote and Chris Grant's office, and Sam for shepherding us through this on the technical end. Thank you so very much. I also wanted to please remind you and to highlight 2 upcoming programs we have in this Women's History Month. We have a conversation for an in-person conversation on March 29th about the chair, the Netflix series that hopefully you've been able to watch, and you can come and listen to our colleagues and communicate your thoughts on that program and have a conversation with them. And lastly, the Rogo Distinguished Lecture series that we have upcoming, Building Resilience and Connection, an Antidote in Challenging Times. So thank you all again for attending today. Thanks for everyone who made this possible, and enjoy the rest of this International Women's Day.